imagining that there was some path to racial and social justice that does not include those we view as guilty. And I learned some facts that blew my mind. I learned there are more African American adults under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. As of 2004, more black men were disenfranchised than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting laws that explicitly deny the right to vote on the basis of race. Now, of course, during the Jim Crow era, poll taxes and literacy tests operated to keep black folks from the polls. Well, today, felon disenfranchisement laws in many states accomplish what poll taxes and literacy tests ultimately could not. A black child born today has less of a chance of being raised by both parents than a black child born during slavery. And that this is due in large part to the mass incarceration of black men. There was an article written about this in The Economist magazine entitled "How the Mass Incarceration of Black Men Harms Black Women." And in the article explained that the majority of black women in the United States are unmarried, including about 70% of professional black women, and that this is due in large part to the mass incarceration of black men, which takes them out of the dating pool at the years they would be most likely to commit to a partner, to a family. But what's worse is that by branding them criminals and felons at early ages, often before they're even old enough to vote, they're rendered permanently unemployable in the legal job market for the most part, virtually guaranteeing that most will cycle in and out of prison, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Now, I find that many people have a general sense of, understanding that when someone is released from prison, life is hard. But I find that most people don't fully appreciate that today, in the era of mass incarceration, once you've been branded a criminal or a felon, you're ushered into a parallel social universe in which the basic civil and human rights that apply to others no longer apply to you. For the rest of your life, you've got to check that box on employment applications asking, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And it doesn't matter whether that felony happened a few weeks ago, a few months ago, or 45 years ago. For the rest of your life, you've got to check that box, knowing full well the odds are sky high that application's going straight to the trash. Hundreds of professional licenses are off limits to people convicted of felonies. In fact, in my state, in Ohio, until just recently, you couldn't even get a license to be a barber if you'd been convicted of a felony. What do people released from prison expect us to do? Housing discrimination is perfectly legal against people with criminal records. Both private landlords and public housing officials free to discriminate. Deny people a place to sleep. In fact, you could be denied public housing just based on arrest records. Not even convicted. You don't ever have to be convicted. Just an arrest record can be enough to exclude you from public housing. Where do you go? Where do you sleep? Discrimination in public benefits is legal and absolutely routine. In fact, under federal law, you're deemed ineligible for food stamps for the rest of your life if you've been convicted of a drug felony. Fortunately, many states have now opted out of the federal ban on food stamps for drug offenders, but it remains the case that thousands of people can't even get food stamps because they were once caught with drugs. What do we expect people in this age of mass incarceration to do upon release from prison? Can't get a job, barred from housing, even food stamps may be off limits to you. Well, apparently what we expect them to do is to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars in fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support, which continues to accrue while you're in prison. And in a growing number of states, you're actually expected to pay back the cost of your imprisonment. And paying back all these fees, fines, court costs, and back child support can be a condition of your probation or parole. And then get this, if you're one of the lucky few who actually manages to get a job straight out of prison, up to 100% of your wages can be garnished. 100%. To pay back all those fees, fines, court costs, and accumulated back child support. What do we expect people released from prison to do? What does the system seem designed to do? Seems designed, in my view, to send folks right back to prison, which is what, in fact, happens the vast majority of the time. About 70% of people nationwide who are released from prison return within a few years, and the majority of those who return in some states do so in a matter of months because the challenges associated with mere survival are so immense. Now, this phenomenon is not something that affects just some small segment of the African American community. No, to the contrary. In many large urban areas, more than half of working-age African American men now have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. In fact, in some cities, like Chicago, for example, the statistics are much worse. Some years back, a study was released in Chicago showing that if you take into account prisoners, in other words, if you count prisoners as people, and prisoners are not counted for unemployment purposes, unemployment statistics excludes prisoners, poverty statistics excludes prisoners, but if you actually count prisoners as people, in the Chicago area, nearly 80% of working-age African-American men were found to have criminal records, and thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. These men are part of a growing undercaste, not class, caste. A group of people defined largely by race, relegated to a permanent second-class status by law. Now, I find that when I tell people that I now believe that mass incarceration is like a new Jim Crow, a new caste-like system, people typically react with shocked disbelief and say, how can you say that? How can you say that? Our criminal justice system isn't a system of racial control, it's a system of crime control. And if black folks would just stop running around